Welcome to Faculty Voices. Our guest today is Alejandra Caraballo. She is a clinical instructor at the Cyberlaw Clinic at the Berkman Klein Center for Internet and Society at Harvard. She used to work with trans-Latina immigrants in Queens, and we're here today talking about the future of trans-Latinas in this upcoming new administration. Welcome, Alejandra.
Thank you. Thank you.
First of all, before we get into the impact of Trump 2.0, could you tell us a little about the work that you were doing in Queens and what kind of challenges people faced?
Yeah. So when I started my legal career at New York Legal Assistance Group, I primarily was doing immigration related work. I did a bunch of legal work, family law, immigration, name changes, some small civil and housing stuff and discrimination work. But I would say about like 80% of my casework was immigration related. So it was screening clients for potential asylum claims, U visas for the victims of crime, T visas for survivors of human trafficking, and basically any kind of immigration relief that we could get for the clients that I worked with. The vast majority were trans-Latina, usually from Central America. It wasn't exclusively. So I worked on some immigration matters as well, like asylum from countries from the Middle East and the Caribbean, as well as Central America. Most of the work there just really was trying to connect with existing organizations on the ground there. Gosh, it's gone through a few names, but Colectivo Transgender, which is a collective started by the late and great Lorena Borjas, who is very beloved, or was very beloved in the trans Latina community. She was basically the godmother to every trans Latina person in Queens and in New York City in general. And I get all my clients from her. She would meet these trans women in some of the clubs by handing out safer sex guides in Spanish, contraceptives, condoms, and other things, and getting people to resources for HIV, as well as meeting them. And it was called the Human Trafficking Court, but it was essentially where they sent sex workers when they were arrested. And she would get them into groups so that they found community, but then also get them access to resources. And so she would really, and she was persistent at it. She would not take no for an answer, and made sure that lawyers were taking her seriously and taking the people like that she was bringing very seriously to get them services. And so a lot of it was just doing a frontline immigration screening, and the vast majority of them had crossed the border unlawfully without inspection. So that meant that they were, for the most part, locked out of most forms of immigration relief. Asylum was very difficult because sometimes the clients had been in the country for 20 plus years unlawfully. There were some exceptions because there's usually what's called a 1 year bar rule for asylum, which means like if you've been in the country for longer than a year, you can't apply unless there's like very extenuous circumstances that you have to meet to overcome that bar. And transitioning or coming out as trans or sometimes met that hurdles. It was doing a lot of that work and then submitting immigration work applications and then getting them connected. Because once we had an immigration application in, New York goes above and beyond typical funding for public services. So we could get them on aid, like things like ADAP, which was for HIV care. We get them on Medicaid for under what was called PRU-Call, which is like permanently residing under color of law, as long as they had a pending immigration application in. And so we could get them really connected to get access to healthcare and all these things and community. And so that was like one of the most important aspects. But a lot of my clients, some of my clients were coming straight from ICE detention. They were being released either through bond because there was exhaustive efforts to get trans people who were held in ICE detention released. But yeah, that's as much of a nutshell summary of the kind of work I was doing.
So it sounds like you were working in an environment in New York State which was at least fairly open to human rights and trans rights. Now we're facing a really different situation as Donald Trump is beginning to take over the presidency. During his campaign, he made two of these issues really important, campaigning a lot against transgender rights and people, and campaigning a lot against immigration rights and people. It sounds like people are being set up for a double whammy.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think to go to the most discussed ad or the most seen ad of the cycle, which was the one with Kamala, the they, them, Kamala Harris ad. And it really tied the two issues together, which for me personally was like just deeply unsettling as someone who started my career working with trans immigrants. Like these were a group of people that I knew well and I worked with for years. And to see like that issue get conflated in that way when I knew like the true horrors of the system, it's beyond infuriating, like the level of rage that I felt. And because I was just trying to watch Patriots games and like it would come on, watching the World Series, it would come on and it was nonstop. And I think one of the most frustrating things is like that moment that was taken with Kamala Harris being interviewed by Mara Kiesling, then the head of National Center for Trans Equality, like the videotape. That was in 2019. And I think at the time then, one, Kamala had been on the defensive for actually in the Norsworthy case, not actually providing care to trans folks who are incarcerated. She actually was lying in the way that she was using that at the time. And that's the worst part about it is that her support was disingenuous. And then that disingenuous support at the time is like what ended up like coming back to haunt her. And I think if she had actually had an understanding, like she would have been able to address that question a lot better. But I think the broader context at that time in 2018, 2019 was we had multiple deaths of trans women in ICE detention. And the stories that I was hearing from trans women who had been released and made their way to New York was just horrific abuse, not just by other incarcerated, or sorry, not, or should I say incarcerated, other detained immigrants. And from the staff themselves, there was sexual harassment, sexual assault by guards in these facilities. And they were, because it was a private for-profit, what was it, detention facility, there was an immense incentive. I think it was a core civic that was running it. There was a tremendous incentive to withhold even basic necessities. So they would withhold HIV medications. They would withhold access to even basic hygiene and sanitary items. And so the level of abuse is just astronomical. And in many ways, immigrants don't even have the basic level of protections of someone who has been arrested and charged or even convicted, because once you're convicted of a crime, Eighth Amendment protections, a cruel, unusual punishment apply. But because immigration detention is considered a civil process, you aren't entitled to Eighth Amendment protections. You're only entitled to Fifth Amendment due process protections, which are completely separate legal doctrines. And therefore, like getting access to medications, those kinds of things are exceptionally difficult. And so that's the reality of what it was for trans women, especially those detained. And many of them had been trafficked in Mexico by cartel members. So they literally get to the border, they turn themselves in immediately, and then they're put in these horrific conditions and then hoping to contact people to get bond so that they can then make their way to New York or other cities and then bring their asylum claims. And for many of them, these asylum claims are very valid. Honduras at one point had the highest level of murders of trans people in the world. It was essentially a death sentence to be trans in any of these Central American countries, particularly what they called the Central American Triangle countries, which was El Salvador, Honduras, and Guatemala. And that's where the vast majority of my clients came from. And there was a lot of effort to put support behind trans people, especially in New York City, to help, especially with the first Trump administration, this resistance mindset. So there was a lot of support there. And I think it's instructive of where we need to put our efforts into, which was so much of it was community organizing. It wasn't like formal organizations. It was like people on the ground on Facebook chats, like connecting these women with their like support and resources so that they could get out of detention and then get to New York. But I think one of the things I always share from this is there's a cautionary tale in how you do resistance work. If it's not informed by the realities on the ground and you're doing it just out of like principle without understanding the ramifications, you can oftentimes make things so much worse for the people who are least equipped to handle it. And the way I say, the reason I say this is because originally, towards the tail end of the Obama administration, there had been so much work to get like a trans housing unit for detained trans immigrants. And they had essentially contracted with the Anaheim jail to create a trans pod. And there had been a whole set of supportive infrastructure. They had access to attorneys, caseworkers, all of this stuff. So they had the support and resources. And in the wake of Trump's election, activists sought to say, we do not want to partner with ICE at all, which I totally understand. ICE needs to be abolished. But they were like, we need to cut the contract with ICE and not allow them to use our jails. They got the Anaheim City Council to do that. And so what ended up happening? They closed down the transpod. What did they do? They moved the transpod essentially to a core civic facility in the middle of nowhere, New Mexico, 80 miles from Albuquerque and I think one of the other like bigger cities in New Mexico. And it just literally no resources at all in a much more horrid situation. And so it's one of those things where it's like, you have to understand what you're doing when you're like saying we're going to resist and we're going to stop cooperating with ICE entirely, because the people who are going to suffer the repercussions of that are oftentimes cannot really bear that burden. And I think that one of the lessons I took from that was you have to be principled, but you have to be strategic and you have to make very difficult choices about, okay, maybe we have to accept this ICE contract, but it's better than sending them to the middle of nowhere, New Mexico or Louisiana, which has become the big center point for a lot of ICE contracting for facilities because of the kind of closing down of state prisons being reopened as immigration detention facilities there.
As we face this kind of double whammy, immigration detentions and the threatened deportation of so many people, and the whole emphasis on trans, for lack of a better word, issues, though it's not really issues. What do you see going forward?
Yeah, I'm not going to sugarcoat it. I'm like really terrified of the next 4 years. And I think so much authoritarianism comes through the loss of empathy in other people with other people and like the inability to form human connection. And I think so much of what like trans immigrants are like really at the intersection of both of this, but the targets of the most dehumanizing rhetoric for the past few years have been immigrants and trans people. And part of that dehumanization process is to make the once unthinkable now a necessity. And by that, I'm like essentially building concentration camps for immigrants and people who are like, they can't do this because of this and that. And I'm like, they can. And when they find the inconvenience or the reasons why they can't, they will use pure power and force to get around it. And I think there's a failure of imagination and a normalcy bias because people have been raised to think that it can't happen here, like the kind of famous Sinclair Lewis novel, but that it so much can. And I think we've essentially have a permission structure societally now to engage in that. And I think what people don't understand is when you start this deportation machine, which we already have, mind you, it's not like something that is going to be started from scratch by the Trump's second term. And I think just today, like it came out that Biden deported more people than anyone since Obama in 2014. Essentially, like this is a bipartisan effort essentially to create this deportation machine. But part of the problem is that it's operated under a guise of legality and under the auspices of this administrative state. So it has this implicit structure to it, a bureaucracy. But what we see with the Musk and the Trump types is this like effort to destroy the bureaucracy and destroy the administrative state. And those are the checks that, while they still enable horrific human suffering and human rights abuses, like at least are some kind of bulwark from just sliding down into pure depravity. And I think what's going to ultimately happen is when you get down this lane of we're going to they want to deport 10 million, 20 million. They want to even deport US citizens, like the children of undocumented immigrants. A lot of these countries won't necessarily accept them. They're not under any obligation to. And so essentially you might render millions of people eligible for deportation stateless. And not to mention the US citizens they may try to deport who are not citizens of their parents' country of origin. And so as a result, might be essentially also rendered effectively stateless. And what will end up happening is they'll have to build large camps to hold people. And that is absolutely terrifying because ICE detention now has been roughly capped at 50,000. But once you start getting at hundreds of thousands and into the millions, that starts costing a lot of money. And I don't mean to trivialize it by just saying it's a costly endeavor, but the greatest atrocities have been committed because we view people as a problem that is too expensive, and it's just easier to do the once unthinkable. And I think when you think of it that way, it becomes, okay, this is a process to disappear people. And once they've gone through immigrants to lock people up without due process and without rights, what's next? Political dissidents, enemies of those in power, of the oligarchs. And it is absolutely a process, and it's one that's dictated essentially by oligarchs and the mob. And I don't know, it's a thing I've been spending a lot of time thinking about. And in so many ways, trans people and immigrants have been the canaries in the coal mine of like where this is heading and the kinds of tactics that create the permission structures for society to engage in these atrocities.
Why trans people?
I spent a lot of time thinking about that too. And I just finished rereading Judith Butler's The Trouble with Gender, or The Problem with Gender. And in so many ways, think about authoritarian movements in the 20th century were so defined by race. And especially when we think of as like fascism, like this, particularly the German incarnation, but also like even the original Italian incarnation and others that viewed like essentially an outgrowth of imperialism and colonialism. And I think the modern incarnation of authoritarianism has been less focused on race and more so on gender. And we've seen this in Putin's Russia, obviously, but Viktor Orban in Hungary, that this return to traditionalism, which they view as men at the top of the social hierarchy, particularly white men, not saying that the race isn't inherently a part of this, it very much is, but there has been much more of a focus on gender, I think, than inherent race in some ways. And I just finished reading Autocracy Inc. by Anne Applebaum and Strong Men by Ruth Ben-Ghiat. And the kind of through line that I've been seeing of this is trans people represent the ultimate kind of escape from arbitrary social norms, right? You ask people, why do girls wear dresses? And they're just like, because they do, right? And they don't realize that it's informed by societal norms. There's nothing biological about, even people are like, biological pronouns. What the hell is a biological pronoun? Like language is made up. Like a good portion of this world doesn't even use gendered pronouns. Mandarin does not have gendered pronouns when spoken. It was only when it was like more standardized in like the last century that they added gendered pronouns in the written version. But like these kinds of things that we reify ultimately are a result of like us trying to make sense of the world, and things that fall outside of it scare us. And then it's then easier to demonize that. And so trans people are inherently like, we fall outside of so many cultural and social norms that it's really easy to demonize. And I think in some ways, decades ago, I think it was gays and lesbians that were at the forefront of that. Not that trans people weren't. There just was a weirder kind of way that trans people were in the conversation. There was exploitation films in the 1950s, like Glenn or Glenda, which I recommend people look on YouTube for the trailer for that film. And it just like trans people were in the cultural zeitgeist somewhat. People understood it, but they viewed it as like this modern advancement. This is, look at the miracle of modern science and technology. I think at the time there was this optimism. It was still from the 30s of the technology can save us kind of thing, and viewing trans people as a creation of technology. Whereas gays and lesbians were viewed as aberrant behavior and like viewed in that lens. Not to say that they weren't conflated, and it's very difficult, but yeah, I just think people view trans people as the ultimate rebels of society. And then in that way, at the same time, most people have never met a trans person. So it's very easy to demonize. And so it's very easy to say, look at this cultural excess. And it ties into these kinds of, I would say, even like normalized anti-Semitic tropes of like cultural Marxism, like that are labeled by the far right, which now have become shockingly normalized. But this kind of trope of they're pushing this revolution through these, and it's always a mysterious they, which obviously like always lends itself to anti-Semitic conspiracy theories, and again ties into immigration with the Great Replacement. But it all kind of ties into this like paranoid conspiracism. And I think trans people fit neatly in that. They say they're able to message to women saying trans people are a plot to erase you. And then like trans people are a threat to men because they're going to demasculinize you or feminize you. And like we serve as this perfect boogeyman for whatever the inherent cultural anxiety is of the moment. And I think right now, I'm not surprised that the backlash against trans people's healthcare has come in amidst the broader backlash against healthcare post-COVID. And at the same time, there's this kind of broader anxiety about fertility rates, which I just think is, I don't know, it's a huge tell when people start talking about it, where their sympathies tend to be. But I think at the same time, it's the focus on trans people has been about fertility. And I think they view it as somehow undermining this. And I think it ties back to this kind of authoritarian idea of nationalism, of people who you're supposed to reproduce and have children and make the country stronger. And it ties into the classic fascist ideal. And I think trans people subvert all of that. They don't just subvert liberal democracy. Like we subvert all of these kinds of things. And so I think it's easier to destroy what you don't understand.
Yeah. So talking about gender, some people are afraid that the Supreme Court could roll back gay marriage in the same form as they rolled back Roe versus Wade. As a lawyer, what do you see as those possibilities? Is that a real concern?
Oh, yeah. I would say within the next decade, I would put it on our current path like a greater than 50% chance that something like Obergefell gets overturned. None of the justices that voted for Obergefell or that were in the majority are like in the majority now. Like all of them are the conservatives. And so what really matters is will they overturn such a recent decision with immense ramifications? Because what do you do with all the existing marriages? There's actual practical things that are very difficult to disentangle. And I think it's not a surprise that where Russia was a decade ago with this kind of anti-gay propaganda law that they passed in 2013 and where they ended up getting to, I think is not a surprise because Hungary has gone down this route. Poland has gone down this route. And I think it's part symptom and means to an end for this kind of authoritarianism, whereas a rollback in the rights of women with abortion, gender minorities with trans folks, and additionally LGBTQ rights writ large, like all of these countries that have moved towards authoritarianism have all gone at LGBTQ rights in particular. And again, I think it's both a symptom and a means, because I think it's one of the means that they achieve power. And I think it's one of the symptoms that you see in backsliding democracies. I would say as things get worse, I fully expect the court to move in that direction. And even if they don't, there's going to be so many like death by a million cuts that essentially same-sex marriages are going to be relegated to a second-class marriage, in the sense that now there are states trying to push what's called covenant marriage, which is just marriage to, I don't know, it's like a much more restrictive form that requires like all of this like marriage counseling and eliminates the ability for no-fault divorce and makes it like a mandatory 2-year cooling off period to get divorced. And so it's an effort to essentially enforce like marriages and not allow anyone to leave them. And they also require you to affirm an oath that is inherently gendered that won't allow for same-sex marriages. So it's a type of marriage. It's supposed to be treated equally. But as we see, eventually they'll start granting privileges. They can start granting tax benefits. They can start granting all of these things to certain types of marriages that are going to inherently lock out same-sex marriages. And we could see religious freedom being used again as a cudgel. And eventually you start getting to a point where you're not going to, even though you're technically married, you don't have any of the same rights. And then by the time you get to that point, it's not as much of an issue to just strike it down because it wasn't as worthwhile as a full marriage anyways. And I think that's inherently the risk that we have. And I think my last point on this is also the Obergefell decision was a terrible decision. Like, not an outcome in legal writing and actual setting of a standard for analysis of gay rights. Anthony Kennedy wrote a terrible opinion because he didn't set a standard for how you analyze laws targeting LGBTQ people. He could have set intermediate scrutiny. He just wrote this lofty decision about due process and equal protection and didn't set a standard, didn't really, and I think there's a reason why Obergefell was not cited at all in the recent oral arguments for gender affirming care. And it's barely been cited in the years since because it is a horrible decision to cite to get anything workable out of that is actually protective. And I think that is problematic because if you can't build further precedent and case law from it, it's going to be much easier to take away because there's not a lot of stuff resting on it. And I think in that way, it makes it an easier target to roll back. I will say that the one benefit that I think LGBT people have is that it crosses so many cultural and class lines that I think it'll make it somewhat more difficult, but it's a process and it's one that over a decade could easily get us to a point where everyone is, this is fine.
So you talk about it crossing cultural and class lines. Don't trans people cross cultural and class lines?
Yeah. Caitlyn Jenner is hanging out at Mar-a-Lago regularly. Despite the kind of campaign that Trump had, he's still friendly with Caitlyn Jenner. And one of his campaign surrogates, Trump's campaign surrogates, was Caitlyn Jenner's manager, who's also a trans woman. And she was on Fox News, like plugging the Trump campaign. It's one of those weird things, but I think in the trans community, we view it as essentially like voting for the leopards eating faces party and then being surprised when the leopard eats their face. And I think a lot of us jokingly, there's a meme that goes around online, I've used it quite a bit, is the Ernst Röhm Award for collaboration, for excellence in collaboration. And for people who don't know who Ernst Röhm was, he was the head of the SA in Nazi Germany. And he was pretty openly gay. Hitler knew he was gay. Most of the Nazis knew he was gay. But he was a threat to Hitler's power. He came out of the more traditional socialist organizing. And in the Night of the Long Knives, he was infamously murdered by the SS officers. And so the reason why we say that is that you think you're safe in these positions of power and influence when you're a part of this minority group and you think it's going to protect you, but it absolutely will not. They will come for you just as much as the rest of us. And I think the other meme, I think a lot in memes, so that I've always seen is the other one that encapsulates it is we've gotten rid of all of the drag queens and trans people. What's next? And then the next comic strip line is them getting shot in the head right after they are given a medal that says #1 degenerate. And it's grim, but it's at the same time, it's encapsulating the issue. It's just you're oppressing your own community to save yourself, but it ultimately will not save you either. And I think that's the view of it. And I think people like Peter Thiel, who's another person who's openly gay and who has been bankrolling and funding a lot of this on the far right, they're so arrogant that they think that these forces that they're unleashing won't come for them. And I think the most infamous example of that was just a week ago, he was interviewed by Piers Morgan, and they were asking him about the Luigi Mangione assassin. And he just was stuttering and like looking all over the place. And I don't know if it was just that question in per se, but it seemed like he almost had a terrifying feeling of, oh no, we started to unleash the mob a bit, and the mob is getting out of control. And yeah, I think that's a kind of Frankenstein moment that a lot of these people are going to realize, is that they thought the allegiance with the mob was beneficial and strategic in the moment, but ultimately it's a beast that they can't control.
When you talk about the mob, Alejandra, what are you talking about?
I found myself really, in the wake of the election, rereading and really studying on the origins of totalitarianism by Hannah Arendt. And the amount of things that just resonate with the current moment just really struck at me. And there was a section, and for this, I actually just was rereading that section, which is like the allegiance between capital and the mob. And in what was interesting is just like how she noted that there was this kind of like populist wave of people who come from the masses, right? Like they're alienated from society, they're pulled away from community. And Rent had a really good part about it where she talks about the difference between loneliness and solitude. And the masses arise from people experiencing loneliness and people who feel rejected from society. But particular people who've been rejected from society, it's usually people who already experience some form of privilege. And so it's the people like Donald Trump, who historically we knew as someone who was rejected by high society in New York. For years, he was viewed as crude. And then now, and part of it is that mob mentality of we're this kind of disaffected, alienated, populist mob that feels like we've been improperly rejected from power, from society, or acceptance. And therefore, we're going to take it back and take delight in the cruelty of it. And it reminds me of one thing that struck me as really apt for our times was Donald Trump parading all of these people through Mar-a-Lago for the last few weeks. Justin Trudeau was at Mar-a-Lago, and you just can see the discomfort of being forced to have to go there and meet with him. And there was a line in Arendt's book, which was written in 1951, so it was like from 1947 to 1951, so it was like very close to that time where, like at the time, it was viewed as a humiliation for a lot of people to go and have to interview with Mussolini or Hitler at the time because it was viewed as degrading because this was this outsider person who had been cast out from high society. And I think, oh, there's a lot of fellow travelers and common people, and as Arendt noted, across class lines as well. And I can't help but think about how most of the far right people who've been pushing this propaganda for years, Ben Shapiro and others like the Daily Wire, or Steve Bannon, they're failed Hollywood people. They wanted to go to Hollywood and make movies and write scripts, and they were terrible at it. And so then they just went reactionary. And I don't think it's a surprise that like that's what I mean by the mob. And they unleash this like primal force of the masses by picking on this force of alienation and in many ways enacting policies that further alienate people and create loneliness that then becomes a positive feedback loop for building an authoritarian movement. Although I differ from Arendt a little bit on saying, I think she highlighted a lot of it, but her focus on totalitarianism, I think, was more isolated to the particular time and moment, whereas modern authoritarianism is much more sophisticated and moderated.
So, with this quote, sophisticated and moderated authoritarianism, as Donald Trump assumes his second term, what do you expect for the first month, for the first year? What do you fear for the first month, for the first year?
Yeah, my worry is a shock and awe campaign because they've had years now to plan their return to the White House. This isn't 2017 where they didn't have a plan. They didn't have a transition team. It was all ad hoc. And you had a lot of leftovers from like Republican centrist policymakers and as well as from the Obama administration. Whereas now I think their plan is to essentially purge everyone on day one. And all of the checks and the bureaucracy are going to be removed and they're going to be replaced by people who, if you look at, a lot of people have been like saying there's no consistency ideologically on the types of cabinet picks, right? You have RFK, Tulsi Gabbard. Again, two people, back to my prior point, who have been like pushed out and discarded by the rest of society or the political apparatus. But you have them, and then you have some of the Project 2025 folks, and you have this mishmash. And ideologically, it doesn't make sense. And the only thing, if you think about it, is they're only successful because they're loyal to Trump. And if their loyalty is the only thing that matters and is important, then their only ideology is loyalty to the strongman. And I think in that sense, that's what's terrifying, because loyalty, not to make a pun, trumps competency. And they're going to staff the government with incompetent people whose only primary directive is loyalty. And I think one of the hallmarks that Ruth Ben-Ghiat noted in her book was like they constantly pit people against themselves so that no one can emerge as an alternate power center against the leader. So Trump's infamous at doing this. And so that's what worries me. So I think it's going to be chaos. I think it's going to be chaos again, but I think it's going to be shock and awe, and it won't be able to be as detailed because so many things are going to be happening all at once. And I think it's going to be tough for anyone to keep up with it. And I think what worries me is essentially the institutions that kept Trump in check in the first term are gone. They're effectively gone. The media is gone. They've all kissed the ring. All of the billionaires have shown their true colors and essentially neutered their own newsrooms. Bezos with the Washington Post, the owner of the LA Times. We've now seen even MSNBC getting spun off, and places like Vice have shuttered. It's a completely different media landscape, and Meta has consciously moved towards a non-political driven algorithm that pushes vapid content that doesn't have any political leaning to distract people, and then disencourages our political content. If you're talking about, hey, Trump's doing this terrible thing, you're not going to be seen, right? But hey, look at this dog jumping up and down, like that'll keep you entertained. Versus Twitter, which is now a weaponized disinformation machine. And all of the media is going to be essentially neutered, and effective opposition is going to be made effectively almost impossible and very exceedingly difficult. And I think on that end, the guardrails are off. And so we could see a huge move. But in terms of like actual policies, I think on day one, we're going to see restrictions on trans people. I think there's going to be tons of executive orders around how the federal government defines sex, policies around gender marker changes. We could see bans on gender affirming care. In terms of immigration, like it's going to take a lot to get that apparatus up and going. But I think it's going to be one of the things in the first year that they're going to purposefully do. And I think what they're going to do is more focus on high visibility things, like carrying out raids in churches, carrying out raids in factories in the middle of the city, like pulling people off the streets of Manhattan. I think what they want to do is strike fear in people and let fear drive it. And so I think in that way, the policies are going to be like fairly horrifying. But I think at the same time, it's going to be chaotic, because a lot of these people are not competent at what they're going to do, and it's going to result in a lot of chaos.
Alejandra, you're depressing me. What can we do?
Yeah, part of the reason I've been digging so deep into this, like all of this stuff about authoritarianism and like how to survive it and get through it, is realizing that some of these things are bigger than us in the moment, and all we can do is build community and survive. I think in a lot of ways, if authoritarianism thrives off of the lack of empathy and the alienation and the lack of human connection, then all we really have is each other. And we need to consciously build those bonds and build solidarity. And solidarity is the antidote to authoritarianism. And I think that's one of the reasons why it thrives so much off of dividing us and pitting us against each other. And so I think in practical ways, like volunteer with mutual aid, donate to your local orgs, like get involved working at your local shelter, build solidarity and community with the people who really need it, because ultimately that's who we have as each other. And I think that's going to be the most important thing, but that's going to be the most basic foundational thing that you can do. And I think find what you're also good at. If you're really great at litigating things, we're going to need lawyers by the truckload. See what you can volunteer. If you work at like all of these things, like I always tell lawyers at firms, try and get involved in pro bono efforts to litigate, because there's going to be a lot of need for that. If you're a historian and that you understand these movements broadly, be out there in public, like placing the current moment, because I think so much of our media right now, what it lacks is contextualizing it in broader history. And we're so obsessed with the now and the moment. And I think we need more of that. Everyone can play a part. I think the most important thing to also remember is that it's not up to you to save the world. Everyone has a part to play, but it's not up to you individually. And I think do what you can and no more, no less. Because if you do more, you're going to burn yourself out, and you're no use to anyone if you're burnt out within the first few months. And if you're not doing enough, we're not going to get through this moment. So do what you can, find what you're good at, build community, and build solidarity.
Thank you so very much for participating in Faculty Voices. You've been listening to Alejandra Caraballo. She's a clinical instructor at the Cyberlaw Clinic at the Berkman Klein Center for Internet and Society at Harvard University. Thank you, Alejandra.